The strategy for high population, low-tech countries like Japan has evolved massively over the course of Victoria 3. With corn laws having been changed, modernizing a nation with huge arable land reserves is very difficult. Normally, some exports, some extra livestock ranches, and maybe some groceries, alongside some production method manipulation, can force the grain price high enough to trigger corn laws. But with Japan, the price of grain is very stable and hard to manipulate due to most of the supply coming from subsistence farms. With that in mind, my goal here is to provide a guide for Japan that is not dependent on corn laws and instead demonstrate how even a very illiberal nation can liberalize through nothing but buildings and just a little bit of luck. Victoria 3 will always be a game of some luck, but I assure you that with this strategy you'd have to get immensely unlucky to not succeed. We're going to be playing a mostly peaceful Japan. What I mean by that is that I'm just going to build up my economy and keep my relations up with all of the global powers so that I can keep myself safe. Later on in the run, just for a bit of fun, I did start doing just a little bit of conquest, but my intention with this guide is to be something of an economic and liberalization guide. Before we get into this, I have received feedback from an IRL friend of mine that watched the Super Germany video that I talked too fast. I'm aware of this, and if you've seen my streams, you know I already talk at about half speed for my YouTube videos, so I'm going to try and slow it down even more since I have seen some comments saying similar critiques. Let me know if this video is easier to understand. Like usual, there will be subtitles available for people that have trouble understanding the video anyway. Okay, let's get into it. If you've seen much Victoria 3 content, or if you've just played the game a bit and learned some about how the macro game goes, then you know that getting your construction up is basically the most important thing ever. I've gone on and on about creating jobs and adding debt limit and all kinds of stuff that I think flies over people's heads, so I want to actually zoom in on some of this stuff in just a moment. First, if you're playing Japan, I recommend building up your construction in Tohoku, where there's a local source of iron and wood. Get yourself 10 construction sectors there, build up all the lumber, and then get some tools that we can use for the lumber camps and for iron mines in the future. The reason we want our construction where there's a lot of lumber is that the local price for wood will be how much money comes out of your budget to build things. If the construction sector is built away from the lumber camps, it'll have to pay extra to account for the market access price impact, which for Japan is quite heavy due to the traditionalism law. This is also the reason we want our tools and iron in the same spot, since once we go to iron frame construction, we'll have the same issue going on. Tools are also important because they let us get to the next production method on our lumber camps. Why is it such a priority to get our lumber camps up to the next level of production? The obvious answer is that the production method is more efficient, and this is for sure true, but the more subtle and actually important answer is that the jobs are better. As Japan, our goal is to industrialize, and that is very hard with an oppressively powerful landowner interest group, especially without corn laws. On old patches, where corn laws were easy to get, the entire nuance around creating higher level jobs was pointless because a market liberal landowner could solve all our problems. I'm skipping ahead a couple decades just for demonstration to show you the truly important difference in these production methods. Take a look at these tool industries, which by the 1870s I've gotten to the third level production method. Every pop's job gives them a certain modifier towards supporting a particular interest group and a wage modifier. If we look at laborers, we see that they make the base wage and mostly support the rural folk. These intergroup alignments change based on your technology, by the way, as we can see with the machinists, who will eventually support the trade unions once we get labor movement, but for now support similar groups to the laborers. They also make 50% more money than the laborers. Next we've got engineers, and these are the guys we really care about. Engineers often support either the petite bourgeoisie or the industrialists, and that industrialist support is what we're looking for. Oh, and they also make triple the wage of a laborer and double the wage of a machinist. If we want to eradicate the power of the landowners, and we can't pass any voting laws to get that done, we can try and put wealth in the hands of non-aristocrat pops. We do that with better production methods. It's already the case that better methods give more resources, and that's great, but I really do have to emphasize the lesser known benefit of wealth redistribution and interest group empowerment. This can also be a good reason to gun for particular techs in the society tree, such as labor movement, which will make your machinists a lot more likely to support the trade unions. Now, in Japan's case, we don't care much for trade unions. We want industrialists, but you take my point. Feel free to, as you play, check out which interest groups your pops support and see why they support it, and maybe try to plan your economy around creating the pops that will support the laws that you want. That all being said, don't worry about it too much, because it's entirely valid to just always pick the best production methods and not even think about it. Better production methods are very good for all these reasons, and with that, we'll refocus on the early game for Japan. With all the authority Japan starts with, it's a pretty good move to set down a ton of decrees like road maintenance and resource industries. We want road maintenance because it adds infrastructure alongside a small construction efficiency bonus, and then we want the resource industry because the most important stuff for us right now is our wood industry. The cheaper our wood, the cheaper our construction, and therefore the more we can build. We can also drop down some social mobility decrees to help with our literacy, although Japan has the special Terracotta system journal, which at a baseline increases their literacy to a pretty acceptable number, but more is always better, so why not get more? I'm focusing my decrees in Tohoku and Kansai because this is where most of our iron is. Iron is going to be very useful later down the line, so those two states will be our primary focus for now. We're also going to put some work into Kyushu because it has coal, but that will come a little bit later. Another small note about the importance of the lumber camps. Take a look here in June of 1837 at how much money these lumber mills are making. I don't particularly care for those profits right now since most of it is going to waste due to the immense inefficiency of government dividends under a traditionalist economy. What I do care about is that eventually, some capitalist or some shopkeeper somewhere in a financial district nearby will buy these lumber camps and begin accumulating wealth. Normally we want wealth to accumulate in the lower classes so they can gain standard of living, but in the very early game, we need some rich, non-aristocrats to start gaining power, and it all starts with profitable industries that give money to the capitalists. We see the same thing happening with the newly built tool industries, which will be supporting our highly profitable lumber camps, and we can already see that we have a new political movement for wealth voting in 1839. Now to be clear, this is the RNG I mentioned at the start. What political movements you get is pretty much random, although the RNG is influenced by your POPs and their IG supports. You could say that my choice to immediately put down some highly profitable buildings that may have spawned a capitalist or two caused this, but it also could have happened even without that. Regardless, the reason I say the RNG isn't that important is because you always get some kind of political movement, either for homesteading or new voting laws, and if you pass any kind of voting law, you will begin degrading the landowner's power. It's a slow process, but that's okay, because in that time, we will just keep building up our construction sectors and industries. Passing something like wealth voting is not at all easy, unfortunately, and one strategy you could go for would be to get the radicalism up on the political movement by starting and stopping the law passing and raising taxes to create radicals intentionally so that you could abdicate to a revolution, but I chose to instead show the power of building without any cheese. With all my lumber camps built by August of 1840, check out those profits. Still no capitalists in charge, but the local workforce owns some of the camps, and the shopkeepers there might partially support the industrialists, which will help our wealth voting cause. We're up to a 49% success chance, but with 2 setbacks, so it's feeling a bit scary, but even if it fails, we just keep building and we'll hope for another political movement eventually. I got a bit lucky and did pass wealth voting in November of 1841. Immediately, our legitimacy tanks because we need to have our first election, which landowners will of course completely sweep, and keep in mind that POPs will be able to contribute clout with less wealth necessary than before, and that it'll take time for that wealth to build up. I got my first couple of iron mines going in April of 1844. I'm going to make the iron profitable by putting my tools to raw iron production, and this will create a third highly profitable industry in our construction industry, which will begin piling wealth into the hands of our POPs. The nice thing about getting iron so early is that we can switch over to iron construction almost immediately, which I've done in February of 1845. Now I've got 60 construction points and our budget is pretty strong. I chose to build up my gold reserves a ton before going into iron buildings because sometimes swapping construction methods can make a huge economic whiplash that can quickly add to your debt, which as Japan, we must avoid. If you saw the Sick Empire guide, then you already know, but in case you missed it, interest rates on unrecognized powers without laissez-faire are huge. We cannot afford to pay any interest on debt because it'll stack up so quickly and ruin us. For that reason, we will be trying to take on as little debt as possible, hopefully zero. I got atmospheric engine a year later in August, and with that we can start building up our coal and Kyushu so we can get some engineers going. Atmospheric engines unlock a production method for all mines that create engineer jobs, and engineers are a middle strata pop that often supports the industrialists. We can create well-paid engineers using our profitable mining industries. I had a homesteading political movement, but I didn't pursue it because the landowners would have started a civil war over it, and although it's an entirely valid strategy to trigger a civil war and go from there, I wanted to do a relatively normal run here. I got an appointed bureaucrats movement instead a bit later, and that was a law change I was quite keen on. Hereditary bureaucrats give power to the landowners and just aren't that good, compared to appointed bureaucrats which give tax capacity. Once you have a lot more institutions, elected bureaucrats tend to be best, but for now, appointed is great and isn't too hard to pass. Check this out, by the way. In the election of 1850, while still on wealth voting, I'm finally starting to defeat the landowners as a coalition of basically every interest group except the shogunate and its samurai came together to challenge the shogun's power. Even with a victory in the election, the agrarian party still doesn't have much power compared to the shogunate, but now I can slot them into government at least without tanking my legitimacy, and now our options open up significantly. I can pass tenant farmers without the landowners getting super mad, and although I'd prefer homesteading, it's just too difficult to pass with how much power the landowners have. So tenant farmers is good enough. We need to get off serfdom because it prevents peasants from leaving the subsistence farms, and that makes employment quite difficult. An important note, once it gets passed by the way, which it did for me in December of 1852, is that the moment tenant farmers passes, your grain price will skyrocket because the production method that subsistence farms use under serfdom makes a lot more grain than the one that gets used with tenant farmers. Because of that, I did trigger corn laws somewhat unintentionally, but to be frank, it's almost impossible not to trigger corn laws in Japan if you do pass tenant farmers because of the huge grain price hike that comes after. I got myself a modern conservative, put him in charge, and now we can start supercharging our economy. First, I passed free trade, so I could start importing and exporting important goods. Then I, of course, went for laissez-faire. As Japan, we have a ton of pops and a lot of potential for capitalists that can fund our investment pool. For that reason, laissez-faire is very strong. In particular, we have a lot of government-owned industries that are highly profitable, like coal, iron, and lumber industries, and if a bunch of capitalists buy those up, we'll see the capitalists add immense clout to industrialists. I want to add a quick note. This is unscripted here. I wasn't setting my buildings to privatize, so what I'm saying here is accurate, that you make profitable buildings, and then capitalists buy them, and that's really good for destroying the landowner clout. But I'm an idiot and wasn't clicking privatize on anything. So once I pass to laissez-faire, which I will very soon, we'll see that my advice will come to fruition. In your game, you should definitely be privatizing all those construction industries because you're not making a lot of money on them anyway because traditionalism ruins your income efficiency. Just a quick note there. Back to the video. Laissez-faire passed with relative ease in 1855, and with that, we've modernized Japan and can begin truly flourishing. As Japan, we don't really need to conquer anything for a while because we have tons of workers and lots of resources, at least for now, and to demonstrate how powerful you can get off of just smart economic planning, I'm going to focus entirely on my economy and not conquer anything until I get recognition. Gaining recognition is a very slow process in Victoria 3, but as Japan, we have all the time in the world. We're going to start gaining recognition progress relatively soon because we have pretty good literacy, voting rights, and our standard of living isn't too bad. Once it gets just a bit higher, we'll start ticking relatively quickly, and we'll also be trying to get an embassy from a great power if we can, but it's surprisingly hard to do that. There's not a lot we can do without going to war besides building, and I'm basically just building up construction and the occasional burst of rice farms or other consumer goods industries to boost standard of living a bit. Getting high enough GDP per capita and high enough standard of living to get points towards recognition is tough as Japan due to our massive population, but we can try. You're going to notice my gold reserves increasing massively, and this is because of all my government-owned industries are being bought by the new capitalist class that we're developing thanks to our rich pops. Pops can become capitalists if they have enough literacy and wealth, and we've got lots of shopkeepers that can upgrade to capitalists thanks to their huge income from those industries. We've also got some pretty rich engineers that can work their way up there too. Sadly, there's not a lot of interesting info to be seen with regards to how pops change jobs, but it's basically just a matter of wealth and literacy and then an opening for a job. Since most of this run is just building, I took some time to look around the map and check on the world's powers. Check out America here, with a breakaway Free States of America. Zachary Taylor here implemented slave trade, while the Free States, under a king, have banned slavery in California, Texas, Alaska, and most of the North. Amazing. I hit 20 million GDP in November of 1857, and I didn't have a ton of runs on Japan on the current patch, so I can't tell you if that's ahead or behind the curve, but I think it's certainly not bad in terms of the increased GDP. We started at about 11 million, and with traditionalism. I actually maxed out my gold reserves because of all the privatization going on, but I'm at a point where I need railways for infrastructure to keep building, so I'm just going to have to live with a maxed out gold reserve as I get my railways down in order to make space for the construction sectors. Thanks to the market liberal in control of the landowners, they formed a party with the industrialists, allowing me to get them in government very easily. And you can see how over time, the landowners have diminished in power, albeit not completely. It's a slow process to weaken the shogunate, but we're almost ready to kick them out of government and start the honorable restoration. Keep in mind that the honorable restoration entry will fail if you put the landowners back in government after it opens, so make sure you're ready to keep them out of government for a while before you actually go through with it. As we move to 1860, we're starting to enter the mid-game economy, which is where railways and capitalism dominate the game. Railways are the lifeblood of a mid or late game economy because infrastructure, alongside population, are your limiting factors. One thing that's very important, and which I have to credit my change of perspective on to generalist gaming, is the transportation good. Transportation is what railways sell, and it's how railways become profitable. As a good, transportation is consumed by pops and is used for labor-saving production methods on most plantations, mines, and lumber mills. Railways, due to their contribution to infrastructure, are vital for all economies, but their transportation good requires some micromanaging to be profitable due to its role as a local good. Although local goods make sense from a simulation perspective, they are horribly annoying in terms of actually playing the game. You want to set your production methods to use transportation, which is a labor-saving production method. However, you likely won't have enough transportation to avoid a shortage. That means you want to make more railways, but then you're going to have hundreds of unused infrastructure points. Ultimately, micromanaging railways sucks, and I usually just choose to keep all my railways subsidized unless it's truly killing my budget, and just build up railways as much as necessary for infrastructure needs. Once in a while, I'll look through my most important states and reshuffle their production methods to rebalance the price. This is one of those you get what you put in situations. If you're a lazy player, you may find yourself bleeding budgetary income to railway subsidies, and if you're a very diligent player, you can enjoy a highly profitable railway system. No matter what you do, if you want to ensure you always have enough infrastructure, I do recommend keeping your railway subsidized at all times. Keep in mind that subsidies pay out additional wages to keep wages competitive, even if the business is profitable, so you'll be paying extra on the most railways if you subsidize them. Again, you get out of it what you put in. Most of the time, permanent subsidies on railways won't kill you, although you'd be surprised how much of an expense it can rack up if you let it get out of hand. I opened my borders in September of 1860, and this isn't really all that important, but I did go with no migration controls. In theory, this is better if I intend on doing a migration build, but as Japan, migration is hard to come by for two reasons. First, you discriminate against a lot of pops as Japan, even if you get on racial segregation. But second, and most importantly, the pops that you don't discriminate on racial segregation, which would be any culture with the East Asian heritage, are almost entirely locked up in countries like Qing and Korea who have closed borders. With closed borders, pops will not be able to mass migrate out of the country. In theory, if you're playing a more aggressive Japan though, it is possible that you could have some colonial subjects who could supply some cheap discriminated labor for you. Ultimately, I chose no migration controls just in case I ended up veering the path of this run in a new direction. In the following year, I put my construction up to 175 even though I was running a deficit because I had huge gold reserves, and I knew more of my stuff would eventually get privatized, so I might as well do some extra building to burn off my gold reserves. If things get hairy, I'll just pause construction for a bit to let the private industry handle it. The nice thing about laissez-faire is that I don't have to think too much about what to build. The general strategy I'd say for a laissez-faire economy is that you provide the resources, like iron, coal, wood, and so on, and then when those goods are cheap, the private sector will use them to make profitable industries that you want more of, like steel, paper, motors, and clothes. In 1864, I ramped up my construction even more, and I'm doing this because I recognized that I had a lot of extra investment pool funds. It's not always easy to remember to check your investment pool and see how much money you've got coming in, because many people only see the budget number. My budget is massively negative, but I'm continuing to build up construction because ultimately, my private sector can support more construction even if the government can't. Nonetheless, I did downsize my construction in 1865, but I actually don't recommend this. I was still working with the mindset of 1.7.3, which was the patch I did my Super Germany guide on. In 1.7.3, there was a bug that made private investments never use all the available funds in the investment pool because they couldn't build more than a certain number of buildings per tick in the game. That meant that there was no point to pausing construction to let the private sector take over, since the private sector wouldn't build extra stuff. In today's patch, which remains 1.7.5, it's better to just pause government construction since those unused construction sectors will be used by our private sector to keep building. Oh well, you live and you learn. Within just a couple of years, I did get back to over 200 construction points though. A bit of an economic whiplash, but it's working out in the long run. The name of this chapter of the video is Restoration and Recognition, and yet I've gone on this immensely long rant about economies. What gives, eh? In the beginning of 1871, I did finally kick the shogunate out of government, but my legitimacy was below 50, so it didn't actually trigger the Honorable Restoration Journal. We can see that the landowners are down to just 24% clout now, meaning it's getting more and more viable to remove them from power without destroying my clout. Although I lacked the legitimacy to start the journal entry, I can still use my rural folk and samurai interest groups to change my tax laws to proportional taxation. One interesting note about tax laws is that most interest groups that aren't the trade unions will prefer per capita taxation the most, but will often prefer something like proportional or graduated taxation over land-based taxation. For that reason, nations which start with land-based taxation can very easily jump to proportional taxation, which is really strong because this tax law has dividend taxes. With dividend taxes, you can actually see a direct cause and effect between how profitable your industries are and your own government budget. More importantly, dividend taxes target wealthier pops like capitalists and aristocrats, reducing their wealth, and they generally have lower income tax rates than per capita tax laws, so your lower tier pops will become more powerful. Most importantly, the poll tax on land-based taxation goes away, which is a flat tax that pretty heavily hampers your lowest tier pops. Once we pass this tax law, we should see our standard of living go much higher. Standard of living determines wages, so with a higher standard of living, our pops will also make more money, and again, that will increase the clout they give to their interest groups. I started getting my first points towards recognition, likely because my standard of living edged out of the bottom 50, and it'll take a very long time, but I will eventually get recognized at this rate. I'll try to speed it up, but ultimately hitting top 20 SOL or top 20 GDP per capita is pretty tough. Getting an embassy is also very difficult, so I'll try my best, but this will probably take a long time no matter what I do. I also got enough legitimacy to begin the Honorable Restoration, which will take a minimum of 10 years. Ouch. At least in 1873, I passed proportional taxation. We won't see a huge change to our budget, but we're changing who we're getting our money from, which is also important for the purpose of elevating our standard of living. Don't be fooled by that 12.7 average you see right now though, it's being inflated by the philanthropy event, which adds flat standard of living to your pops. It's a very good event, but it does wear off after a while. Anyway, from here it's time to just cruise to the restoration and to recognition. In terms of buildings, you can see in the top right what I'm doing, and you'll notice that it's a lot of railways, iron mines, coal mines, and occasionally some tobacco or other plantation good. That's basically my entire economic strategy. I get the resources going for the market, and the private sector translates them into better goods. I continued that exact economic strategy all the way to 1882, where I restored the emperor and Meiji took over. Although this is a relatively slow restoration compared to what's possible, we already have a lot of what we need to complete the restoration done. All I need to do is retire the samurai, and I'm done with the Meiji restoration already. I'm also about 2/3 of the way to recognition, and I've got over 60 million GDP without any conquest. I'm chilling at 410 construction points with nothing more than the Japanese archipelago's resources and population. One thing I really like about playing Japan is how your economic situation will actually push you into imperialism. I'm soon going to run out of coal and lumber, which will sort of force my hand into invading Korea. Thanks to the renewal of Japan event from completing the restoration, we do get claims on Korea, and once we get recognized, we can conquer Korea for very little infamy. I took the risk on an embassy from France, although it was pretty low risk, as I had a 95% chance of acceptance thanks to our defensive pact, investment rights, and trade agreement. As a quick note about investment rights, in general, I'd say it's a good strategy to allow all investments in your country unless you're a very small nation without much of a base of capitalists. If you're trying to modernize and liberalize your economy, you need capitalists to generate an investment pool and clout for your industrialists. If a foreign power is buying up all your profitable industries, you might have an issue with a lack of capitalists to generate a private sector investment pool. For that reason, I recommend, as a heuristic, not taking investment rights until you've already got a relatively strong industrialist base that won't be as affected by some of the profitable industries being taken over by foreigners. Either way, France accepted the embassy, which jumped me much closer to getting recognition. Working with France is very smart for me because I've got a political lobby with over 60% of my nation's clout in it that wants me to work with France. Not to mention, it's wise to have a great power that will keep me safe from big bad Britain, which, as another quick note, can sometimes completely obliterate you in the early game if they so desire. Although it didn't happen in this run, I generally recommend that if a great power demands investment rights in you, that you just submit to the demands, because if you don't, they might get a treaty poured in you or take a state. You cannot defeat Britain, ever, as Japan, until you modernize. A combination of luck and high relations with France and Russia kept me safe, and now my relations with France will help me get recognized. I passed technocracy, which was actually kind of a mistake. I did it because of a government petition. This was a mistake because now I don't have voting laws, which makes me get recognition more slowly. I wasn't even thinking of that at the time, but I definitely should have avoided removing my voting laws. Outside of the specific need for voting laws to get recognition, technocracy is very strong otherwise and will empower your industrialists and intelligentsia. Look at that industrialist clout. Damn. I've got this massive crowd of positivists, and I'm not even exactly sure how that happened, but I can't help but want to become a republic with all that positivist ideology. I could even go for state atheism, but I do kind of like Shintoism, so I don't think I will. I passed a couple more years, and finally, in 1889, I obtained recognition via a treaty with France. The beast has awoken, and in theory, I could go absolutely wild with a new power block and just massively militarize in order to take on the world, but I want to keep my conquest to a minimum, just so I can focus on the economics of this run, which to me is the more focal guide for Japan. It's easy to build up an army and destroy the AI, but it can be hard to make an effective economy. Here in 1889, got a very powerful Japan with over 80 million pounds of GDP, but my growth will eventually be stopped by a bottleneck of natural resources. All supply chains eventually come back to wood, iron, and coal once you've got steel tools going, so if we run out of even one of those resources, our growth will stop. Japan has a distinct lack of lumber, especially, and this is a problem that Manchuria can solve for us given their immense forests, but we'll get there later. I hit 100 million GDP in March of 1891, and I got myself a French bankroll in April in return for some support in the Ottoman War. Naturally, I did nothing in the war. I could have capitulated, but I guess I just didn't. I don't remember why I didn't at this point, but it didn't matter. I had queued up 50 universities in Kansai a while ago, which finally got to the front of my building queue. With 50 universities in one state, you pretty much get all the innovation you could ever ask for, so we're going to go from being super far behind on tech to being the forefront of the scientific world in no time. I'm going to need some good production tech to catch up to Britain, who as of June 1892 were in first place with 169 million GDP. In second place was the Raj with another 135 million GDP, and then there's me, at third place, with no conquest of any kind, just barely above Qing with 112 million. I was running out of pops by this point, so I implemented all the labor-saving production methods I could to create more workers. It might seem counterintuitive to the goal of giving everyone a job, but keep in mind that labor-saving production methods only get rid of laborer jobs. We can create new industries that will employ more engineers and machinists, which will elevate the wages for the workers once they get re-employed. This has the knock-on effect of also raising the average standard of living in the state, elevating all wages for all workers, laborer, engineer, machinist, and shopkeeper alike. Thanks to the Terracotta system, I was at 60% literacy as a baseline, and to be honest, I don't really even need more than that, but I did implement public schools anyway because I felt right to do so. I'd eventually get my literacy to quite high levels, but literacy rates beyond about 70% aren't really that useful, to be honest. That's just my opinion though, and it's definitely objectively better to get as much as possible. I just find that I have more than enough innovation generation and qualifications at around 70%. I started my electrical industries in September of 1894, and much like railways, power plants are very powerful, but hard to manage because of local good mechanics. Again, it makes a lot of sense that electricity can't travel across states, but it means managing your electricity is really annoying. It's honestly valid to not even use electrical production methods if you don't want to be bothered with it, but it is objectively correct to eventually switch over to electrical production methods because of how good they are. You'll also see at this point that I am starting to go really hard on my budget, taking on huge deficits, and that's because my interest rate is less than 1%. I can more or less ignore all credit at this point so long as I don't go bankrupt. Of course, in order to not bankrupt, I need to keep expanding my industries, but keep in mind that I'm running out of lumber. It's time to get the army and navy going. I got to just over 80 ships and 50 battalions in 1897, and then set my sights on my first target. I attacked Brunei, knowing they had both rubber and wood, two things I needed. Next was Madagascar, which also had those two resources. You'd think I'd go for Korea, but honestly there's a lot more lumber with a lot less hassle off in Africa, and the rubber is a nice bonus. It was in 1899 when I decided to invade Korea, and I was planning to use France to help me in this war. France is my ally, and although I should be able to eventually outgun China, it's important to know that the British never fought the Opium Wars. China hasn't been suffering with opium addiction. Instead, Qing China is pretty strong, and will happily protect Korea from my imperialism. I had just enough maneuvers to call in France and add all of Korea as war goals. France had land in Vietnam, which meant they could, in theory, set up a front there, but France just let Vietnam get occupied, sadly. A combined Japanese and French force worked to land in Korea, which was better than landing in Beijing, because there were not nearly as many men guarding Korea as China. The entire peninsula was occupied quickly, and China would give in eventually. I had shrapnel artillery and skirmish infantry, which compared to the Chinese was a huge advantage, but compared to most of Europe was a bit behind. Regardless, China capitulated in April of 1900, and Japan now rules all of Korea. Korea has a ton of resources, but not really the ones I need. Nonetheless, I'd be building up Korea very quickly and giving all of them jobs there. You're going to see the Korean standard of living shoot through the roof thanks to all these jobs, which is something I feel weird about. What I have in mind with this conquest is that these Koreans are not being elevated, but rather put down and exploited by this conquest, but there's just no real way that Victoria 3 represents that idea, except through colonial exploitation. The problem is that that law just doesn't really do much in terms of simulating an oppressive regime. Even if I had that law, I'd still be improving the lives of Koreans immensely by industrializing their country, but whatever. That's an issue for a whole other video. That being said, I did quickly implement racial segregation to stop discriminating the Koreans, since discrimination is not useful at all in this game. I'd much rather the Koreans make good wages and pay taxes than the industries they work in be slightly more profitable. I got a political movement for census suffrage that I did pursue just because I wanted to shake things up a bit. Technocracy had served me well, but it's time to give the people the vote again. My work towards democracy was interrupted when the French offered a war goal to free the EIC from Britain in a war. I didn't think the war would go our way on account of Britain's overwhelming naval and economic power, but I was willing to join just in case France somehow won. I ended up leaving my capital open because I forgot the British could naval invade, and just capitulated before they could get any devastation on my states. I did complete the Path to Liberalism journal entry in November of 1902, so I guess the Japanese Empire will be one of great freedom as opposed to one of imperial worship. In the election of 1903, the massive industrialist clout was finally crushed in favor of a coalition of the petite bourgeoisie, intelligentsia, and trade unions. I could go communist later, but I don't think I want to this run. I tend to always go communist eventually, but I want to show off the power of a proper capitalist nation with regards to both GDP and standard of living. I hit second great power in December of 1903, which is likely only temporary since France had just suffered a defeat by Britain. In the search of more resources, I went after Qing again, this time to get Manchuria, but to avoid so much infamy, I chose to liberate Manchuria and then subjugate it later. I was also going to liberate Yue and Yunnan just to weaken China, and I called in both France and Russia to help out, just to make sure the war goes smoothly. This war would end up dragging on pretty long because we couldn't get to Beijing fast enough. Also, during the war, I worked towards getting public healthcare. Healthcare is insanely good because it gives extra flat standard of living to your pops across the board, and it negates the effects of pollution, which are nastier than you might think. The Qing War really just kept dragging on because none of my battles were heading to Beijing, which I'm not sure why that was happening, but things worked out eventually. We got close to Beijing, and then Russia capitulated, so we were back to square one mostly. The French were moving up from Vietnam, slowly but surely. The war finally ended in 1907, with Manchuria immediately giving up Vladivostok to Russia. Nice. I had added a treaty port war goal to Qing, and that was because I was considering talking a bit about trade in this video, and using the treaty port to demonstrate a couple things. Ultimately, I decided not to dive into the weeds, if only because it would make the video too long, but I'll give some quick pointers on trade. The best usage for trade is to artificially inflate the price on a good by exporting it, or importing a good temporarily to cover a shortage. You generally don't want to be reliant on imports if you can avoid it, which most mid or late game economies can do. If you're hitting the mid game and you still have market gaps, and you're not doing some kind of zero conquest run, you're making some serious mistakes. Sometimes, for whatever reason, you have a shortage, and imports are great for quickly fixing the shortage until your market evens out, at which point you cancel the trade. This brings us to tariffs, which are a way to translate goods into budget, or a way to harm a country which is dependent on you for trade. In general, tariffs kinda suck, because you'd almost always rather have a larger trade route than have the minuscule income of a tariff, but the real power of a tariff is to make another country's trades with you less profitable, and to protect your goods from being taken away when you don't want them exported out. Without getting too deep in the weeds, the value you gain when the price of a good you want exported, in terms of additional profits on the industries making that good, will usually outweigh the income of a tariff, and if you're importing something to fix a shortage, it's definitely better to lessen the shortage by a larger margin than to bring in a small budget supplement. That's why I generally like free trade as a law, alongside the fact that it reduces the bureaucracy cost of trade routes in general. When I'm setting up trade routes with a country, I usually just look at their market and import whatever stuff they have that's cheap, and export whatever stuff they have that's expensive. With one treaty port, I now have all these amazing trade routes that are producing a ton of income for my trade centers, whose profits will get reinvested into the investment pool and into my pop's pockets. By the way, small thing just about this Japan run, check out that wood trade I have with Russia. Remember when I said Japan is short on wood? Well, you can conquer for it or you can trade for it. I'm importing almost 10,000 units of wood from Russia, and the route is generating revenue for me thanks to how much the trade center can sell it for. Now, this trade deal covers a very important good in my supply chain, and although I have no intentions to fight Russia, it's certainly something to consider if we ever do come to blows. In this way, trade can make you beholden to someone else, but that's just a skill issue. At the end of the day, The answer to my wood shortage is to imperialize and control a larger reserve of wood rather than to rely on imports. Trades do go both ways, and Russia would be a bit unhappy to go to war too since their logging industry relies on my import of their wood. So there's that too. Anyway, with Korea and Madagascar conquered, alongside a high-level Russian trade route, I've got a good amount of lumber for the next couple 100 million GDP points, and as I continue to build the economy, I'm going to change over to a republic. The big reason to become a republic is that it makes your head of state more flexible. With a king or queen, you can never really change your head of state, which if you have a good one is great, but if not, it sucks. Becoming a republic is also the most fun for the purpose of memes, since it lets you do crazy things like making famous Chinese president Sun Yat-Sen the president of Japan. I did this purely for the memes, and because I saw the opportunity to pull it off. I passed the Presidential Republic Law in 1910, which saw Meiji Yamato step down, to be replaced by Sun Yat-Sen, who had been exiled from Qing China some time ago, and who I put in charge of my petite bourgeoisie. He's not a bad president, with ambitious and erudite being pretty okay traits, but Meiji Yamato is pretty good too, so he'll be missed. Either way, this is the part of the run where we do sort of wrap up and do some memes. I wanted to pass multiculturalism, which I failed to do so because the only anarchists I had were the rural folk, and the petite bourgeoisie are a little too racist and powerful to let it pass. But in theory, since I'm on total separation, I could have literally no discriminated pops of any kind through multiculturalism, but it is what it is. In my current situation, having more pops would be very good, and if I could attract some mass migrations, I'd love that. You'll see that in about a decade, once I have literally everyone in Japan, Korea, Brunei, and Madagascar employed, that I'm going to peak my GDP in a way. It'll be a very impressive GDP, given my size, but it will basically be the limit, as I can't produce more without more labor, and by the 1920s, I'll have the best possible labor-saving PMs. You will see the immense GDP and standard of living that this can generate too, by the way. I'm already above 15 standard of living and creeping up on 200 million pounds of GDP, but Britain is certainly still ahead of me. The AI is pretty good at making a strong economy now, although obviously a Britain played by someone with more skill could definitely have 1.5 billion by this point with relatively minimal effort, and with high effort, maybe as much as 5 billion. I hit 200 million GDP in November of 1912, and by that point I was gunning it for top GDP by just throwing up a ton of construction and not caring about loans. Remember, my interest rate is less than 1%. So I really don't care about my debt levels. I'll be losing a minuscule amount of money to interest with that interest rate. I attacked Manchuria in 1913 to make them a protectorate for access to their wood, but Russia supported them, and that hurts because of my dependence on their lumber trade route, but it is what it is. Thanks to my massively inflated construction, I got to 300 million GDP in 1917, and my budget is being kept afloat by all the stuff I'm building getting privatized, and my rapidly expanding economy adding to my tax base and debt cap. I thought about making a power block, but this late in the game, there's not much point. I'd basically just be tanking my relations to all the great powers. I'm so grateful for the ability to build in subjects now, because after I got Manchuria as a subject, I slapped down a ton of rails and farms so I could use them as my breadbasket. Even just one Chinese state has enough arable land to make enough farms to feed almost all of Japan basically, and in combination with my own farms, I could feed the entire market off of the South Manchurian farms. There is 350 million pounds of GDP in December of 1921, but man, I just can't catch up to Britain. I did hit number 1 GDP per capita in August 1922, beating out Belgium just barely, but I did want to beat Britain's total GDP. I took a bunch of land off of Portugal to get more East African rubber and lumber, and I granted Primoria to Manchuria to complete their borders while I was just building whatever I could. I ended up pausing my construction around 1923 so I could keep my budget afloat. This meant my private sector was handling all the building, and I was using a ton of money, mostly as subsidies for power plants, which I didn't realize would be so expensive. I checked the GDP race in June of 1923, and we see that Britain is just a little bit ahead of me with 423 million pounds of GDP, and I'm stuck at just under 400 million, although I do have a higher GDP per capita and an immense 20.5 standard of living. Keep in mind, I have neither workers' rights nor collective ownership. Add in workers' protections for the doubled wage, and a bit more time for the consumer goods industries to catch up on the demand, and we can definitely get to like 23 or so, maybe as high as 25. I more or less peaked at 400 million GDP in October of the same year. I was finally out of pops, although not actually out of resources except rubber. I wasn't able to put all my tools to the best production methods, I didn't have enough rubber, which may have been able to take my standard of living a bit higher, but either way, the answer to my current problem is to conquer a couple Chinese states to gain myself a solid 100 million pops that I could employ, but the year is 1926 now. I can't break past 400 million GDP anymore, since everything I build can't employ except by stealing employees from other buildings, and my SOL is shrinking just a little bit as the stuff I build is ripping workers into new jobs sometimes, and that might be slightly shifting the SOL, but it's nothing big. Basically, this is as far as my country will go until I get more pops. My budget looks bad, but by pausing my construction and ending subsidies on my railways, I can get back into the positive without even raising taxes. If we look around the map a bit for some interesting cultural occurrences, we see that not much happened, except that in Britain, there's a ton of random pops. It seems like Britain was so powerful because they got all the mass migrations. I imagine this is because America was so weak this run. The mass migration meta is very powerful, and even the AI can make good use of it. Mass migrations are a bit of a winner-takes-all system at times, as if you're getting more immigrants, you're getting more workers and more taxes, and therefore more construction, so you can provide more jobs, which will encourage even more mass migrations to your nation. I do applaud the 1.7 AI, but Britain had a lucky game this run. Without the luck, I'd easily be number 1 GDP. Had I conquered a couple Chinese states, I could have just become number 1 GDP by just being able to expand my economy more too. Either way, I hope you learned a thing or two from this run as Japan. The Empire of the Rising Sun is immensely powerful in Victoria 3, and with the right plays, it can easily be the number 1 power, but even with the wrong plays, it can be an amazing number 2. President Sun Yat-Sen bids you farewell. Thank you for your time.